Every major religion on earth has a stronghold in Southeast Asia. Hinduism in Bali, Buddhism in Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Islam in Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Christianity in the Philippines, Confucian influence woven through Vietnam. This isn't diversity by chance. It isn't random. When you look at the map, really look at it, Southeast Asia sits at the exact hinge point between the two greatest civilizations in human history, India to the west, China to the north. Every ship that ever carried spices, silk, or sacred texts had to pass through these waters. Every monk, merchant, missionary, and conqueror who wanted to cross between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific had one option, one corridor, and that corridor was Southeast Asia. The question isn't why Southeast Asia became a cultural crossroads. The question is, how could it have been anything else? But geography alone doesn't explain this story. Plenty of crossroads in history became battlegrounds, wastelands, or forgotten outposts. Southeast Asia became something rarer, a place that absorbed the world's great civilizations and transformed them into something entirely its own. Most people explain Southeast Asia's diversity by pointing to trade, and they're not wrong, but trade is a mechanism, not an explanation. The deeper question is why trade routes formed here in the first place, why civilizations chose this region to project their influence, and perhaps most importantly, why the people of Southeast Asia were able to take those influences and shape them rather than simply be shaped. The conventional story goes something like this. Indian and Chinese merchants arrived, they traded goods, they left behind religion and culture, and over centuries Southeast Asia became what it is today. That version is incomplete in almost every way that matters. What actually happened is more interesting, more deliberate, and more instructive for understanding the modern world. We're going to examine 4 forces that made Southeast Asia the world's cultural crossroads, not just a passive recipient of outside influence, but an active architect of its own civilizational identity. And once you understand this history, you'll understand why Southeast Asia sits at the center of nearly every major geopolitical contest of the 21st century. Before any merchant ship sailed or any monk crossed a mountain pass, the land itself was already writing Southeast Asia's future. Look at the physical geography. The mainland, what we now call Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, is carved by great river systems running roughly north to south. The Irrawaddy, the Salween, the Mekong, the Red River. These rivers created fertile deltas of extraordinary productivity. Rice agriculture flourished here thousands of years before Indian or Chinese influence arrived. Complex, sophisticated societies emerged independently, societies that developed hierarchies, trade networks, and religious systems long before the outside world knew they existed. Then, look at the maritime geography. The island world of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, is threaded through by straits and passages that control access between oceans. The Strait of Malacca is perhaps the single most strategically important narrow waterway on Earth. Today, roughly 40% of global trade passes through it. 2,000 years ago, it served the same function. Whoever controlled the Strait of Malacca controlled the flow of commerce between East and West. This geography created 2 things simultaneously. First, local wealth. The rivers and islands of Southeast Asia produced goods the ancient world desperately wanted. Cloves, nutmeg, pepper, camphor, sandalwood, tropical hardwoods. These weren't luxuries. They were medicine, food preservation, religious ritual, and status symbols all at once. A single shipment of cloves from the Maluku Islands could make a merchant fabulously wealthy in Rome, Alexandria, or Chang'an. Second, that same geography created the need for sophisticated political entities, port kingdoms, river states, maritime empires, capable of managing and taxing the enormous flow of goods passing through. Geography didn't make Southeast Asia a passive conduit. It made it an active power broker. And that distinction matters enormously for everything that follows. Today, when China invests billions in ports and infrastructure across Southeast Asia, or when the United States stations naval assets in Singapore and the Philippines, they are playing the same game that has been played for 3 millennia, the game of controlling these waters. The first great wave of cultural influence to reshape Southeast Asia didn't arrive as conquest. It arrived as invitation. Starting roughly in the 1st century of the Common Era, Indian merchants, Brahmin priests, and Buddhist monks began appearing at Southeast Asian courts. But here's the crucial detail that most ounce get wrong. The rulers of Southeast Asia actively recruited them. Southeast Asian kings weren't passive recipients of Indian civilization. They were sophisticated political operators who recognized that Indian religious and administrative concepts could dramatically increase their own power and legitimacy. The Sanskrit concept of the Devaraja, the God King, was transformative. It gave rulers a divine mandate that transcended tribal loyalty. It created elaborate court ceremony that reinforced hierarchy. It provided a cosmological framework, the kingdom as a representation of the divine universe, that could organize large, complex, multi-ethnic societies. Rulers adopted Indian names, built Hindu or Buddhist temple complexes as cosmic symbols of their power, and invited Brahmin advisors to legitimize their courts. The result was what historians call the Indianization of Southeast Asia, but that term is misleading. It implies passivity. What actually happened was a selective adoption. Southeast Asian rulers took what was useful, the legitimizing power of Hindu-Buddhist cosmology, Sanskrit as a prestige language, Indian artistic and architectural traditions, and grafted it onto deeply rooted local traditions. The spirits, ancestors, and animist practices that had always defined Southeast Asian spiritual life didn't disappear. They were layered beneath and around and sometimes inside the imported frameworks. Angkor Wat is the most visible monument to this process. Built in the 12th century by the Khmer Empire, it is technically a Hindu temple, dedicated to Vishnu, aligned with cosmic Hindu geography, decorated with scenes from the Sanskrit epics. But it was built by Khmer people, reflecting Khmer political ambitions, serving Khmer ritual functions. It is simultaneously Indian and entirely Southeast Asian. You see echoes of this pattern today. When Balinese Hinduism looks almost unrecognizable to visitors from India, that's not corruption of the original. That's Southeast Asian agency in action. The same dynamic shapes modern Thai Buddhism, Javanese Islam, and Vietnamese Confucianism. The region has always been a creative transformer of outside traditions, not merely a recipient. While India shaped Southeast Asia's soul, China shaped its nervous system. China's relationship with Southeast Asia was fundamentally different from India's, and understanding that difference explains much about modern geopolitics. India's influence spread through cultural prestige and religious transmission. China's influence moved through trade, tribute, and, when necessary, force. The Han Dynasty established China's interest in the region as early as the 2nd century BCE, pushing south into what is now northern Vietnam. For roughly 1,000 years, northern Vietnam was directly incorporated into the Chinese Empire, governed by Chinese officials, required to perform Chinese rituals, expected to adopt Chinese administrative systems. This was not Indianization. This was direct imperial control. Vietnam's resistance to and eventual independence from Chinese rule, followed by its careful navigation of Chittagong. Chinese influence for centuries afterward created the political culture that would make Vietnam one of the most fiercely independent nations in Asia and one of the most effective at fighting major powers to a standstill, as the 20th century would later demonstrate. But China's influence across the broader region operated through a subtler mechanism, the tribute system. States across Southeast Asia sent periodic missions to the Chinese emperor, presenting gifts, performing ritual submission, and receiving in return imperial recognition, gifts of Chinese luxury goods, and crucially, the right to trade with China. For Southeast Asian kingdoms, participation in the Chinese tribute system was less about submission and more about access. China was the largest consumer market in the world. Access to Chinese merchants meant access to wealth. The monsoon winds made this connection possible. From roughly May to October, winds blow northeast to southwest across the South China Sea, carrying Chinese ships toward Southeast Asia. From November to April, they reverse, carrying those ships home. This seasonal rhythm created predictable, reliable trade routes that became the arteries of a vast commercial network. Chinese merchant communities established themselves in port cities across Southeast Asia, communities that persist today as the ethnic Chinese diaspora of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. This diaspora has been central to Southeast Asian commerce for centuries and remains economically significant today, which is one reason China's modern Belt and Road investments in the region are received with such complex, layered emotions, part opportunity, part historical memory, part calculation. By the 13th century, a new civilizational force was moving through the maritime world, and Southeast Asia sat directly in its path. Islam arrived in Southeast Asia not through conquest but through commerce, a pattern consistent with how most cultural transformation in the region has occurred. Arab and Indian Muslim merchants had been trading in Southeast Asian ports for centuries, but Islam's real breakthrough came through the Malay trading network. The Kingdom of Malacca, founded around 1400 at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, made a strategic decision. Its ruler converted to Islam. This was not a spiritual epiphany, it was a calculated political move. Conversion to Islam connected Malacca to the vast Islamic trading network stretching from Arabia to East Africa to South Asia, a network that gave Muslim merchants preferential treatment in ports across the Indian Ocean world. Malacca became the greatest emporium in Asia within decades. Ships from China, India, Arabia, and the Indonesian archipelago converged in its harbor. At its height, Malacca's port reportedly hosted merchants speaking 84 different languages. Islam spread outward from Malacca through trade and marriage. Rulers of other ports converted to access the same commercial network. By the 16th century, Islam had transformed the religious landscape of maritime Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, the southern Philippines, while the mainland largely remained Buddhist. Then the Europeans arrived and shattered everything. The Portuguese seized Malacca in 1511, followed by the Spanish in the Philippines, the Dutch across Indonesia, the British in Malaya and Burma, and the French in Indochina. The colonial era imposed new borders, new languages, new economic systems, and new religious pressures. It also, paradoxically, reinforced the cultural crossroads dynamic. Competing European empires brought their own rivalries to Southeast Asia, and local rulers learned to navigate those rivalries much as they had navigated Chinese and Indian influence for centuries. Today, the borders of every Southeast Asian nation are largely colonial artifacts, drawn by European powers with limited interest in the civilizational realities on the ground. Understanding why modern Indonesia contains 270 million people across 17,000 islands, why the Philippines is predominantly Catholic in a Buddhist-Muslim region, or why Vietnam's legal system retains French colonial structures requires looking at this 500-year collision between indigenous civilization, Islamic transformation, and European imperialism. The crossroads kept accumulating layers. Notice the pattern across 3,000 years of this history. Every major civilization that entered Southeast Asia arrived with something to offer and something to extract. India offered legitimacy frameworks and cosmological sophistication. China offered market access and commercial infrastructure. Islam offered membership in a global trading community. Europe offered military technology and, eventually, industrial connection. And in every case, Southeast Asian societies negotiated the terms of exchange. They weren't passive. They adopted what increased their power, adapted what fit their existing structures, and discarded or quietly subverted what threatened their core identities. This is the insight that most histories of Southeast Asia miss. The region's diversity isn't a byproduct of weakness, of being unable to resist outside influence. It's a product of strategic sophistication, of being skilled enough to extract value from multiple powerful civilizational systems simultaneously. Three forces made this possible. First, geographic position meant no single outside power could achieve total dominance across the entire region. India couldn't project military force effectively into maritime Southeast Asia. China could control the northern margins, but not the islands. European powers divided the region among themselves rather than unifying it. This fragmentation of external pressure created space for local agency. Second, economic indispensability meant Southeast Asian states always had leverage. You wanted the spices, the timber, the port access? You negotiated. You didn't simply take, or if you tried to simply take, as the Dutch learned repeatedly in Indonesia, resistance was fierce and sustained. Third, civilizational flexibility, a willingness to adopt surface forms while maintaining deep structures, allowed Southeast Asian cultures to absorb enormous external pressure without losing fundamental identity. Balinese Hinduism, Java, Nese Islam, Vietnamese Confucianism, Thai Buddhism, all are recognizable to their source traditions, yet unmistakably themselves. But here's what complicates this picture. The same geographic openness that made Southeast Asia a creative crossroads also made it perpetually vulnerable. The region's fragmentation, dozens of competing kingdoms, ethnic groups, and linguistic communities meant it could rarely unite against external pressure. The colonial era demonstrated the costs of that fragmentation with devastating clarity. Today's ASEAN is partly an attempt to solve the problem that geography created. How do you build collective leverage in a region that history has always divided? There is a reason diplomats today call Southeast Asia the world's most important region, and historians would tell you that designation is older than most nations on Earth. The South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, the islands of Indonesia, these are not new prizes, they are ancient ones. China's claims over nearly the entire South China Sea, which have generated enormous international tension in recent decades, follow a civilizational logic that extends back to the tribute system and the monsoon trading routes. The United States' pivot toward Asia, its alliances with the Philippines, its deepening partnership with Vietnam, its interest in Indonesian stability. These follow the same geographic logic that drove every major power toward Southeast Asia for 3 millennia. India's Look East policy, its growing engagement with ASEAN nations, reflects an attempt to reclaim an influence that predates the British Empire by 2,000 years. What this history reveals is that Southeast Asia is not a peripheral region that occasionally becomes relevant. It is a permanent center of gravity in global affairs, not because of its military power, but because of its position. Crossroads don't stop being crossroads. The goods change. Spices become semiconductors. Sandalwood becomes liquefied natural gas. But the geographic logic is immutable, and the cultural logic, it turns out, is equally durable. The same capacity for selective adaptation that allowed Southeast Asian civilizations to absorb India and China and Islam and Europe without losing themselves is exactly what makes modern Southeast Asian nations some of the most nimble diplomatic actors in the world, playing great powers against each other, extracting investment from rivals, maintaining sovereignty through strategic ambiguity. They've been practicing this for 3,000 years. The real question isn't whether Southeast Asia will remain the world's crossroads. It's whether the great powers competing there today understand that they are not the first to try and not the first to discover that the people who live at the crossroads have their own ideas about who controls it.